Hi, I'm Matthew from Dark Ascent, and today we're looking at an Everest expedition, where a climber who had spent around $400,000 arrived convinced she would reach the summit. Midway up the mountain, her Sherpa noticed subtle but unsettling changes in her pace and decisions, early signs of a shift that wasn't accounted for at base camp. It's one of those Everest cases that lingers long after you hear it, especially given the budget behind it. It was May 14th, 2016, and the summit window above Everest's South Col had held for 4 straight days, drawing guided teams upward through one of the few stable weather periods of the spring season. At base camp, after 6 weeks of acclimatization rotations between 17,600 and 21,300 feet, the final summit teams were preparing to move for Camp 4 before the overnight push to the top. Revelijn Emmerich was 54 and operated a commercial real estate development firm out of Scottsdale, Arizona. Over the previous decade, she had built a serious mountaineering resume that included Kilimanjaro, Aconcagua, and Denali, and she approached Everest the same way she approached everything else in her life, methodically, financially, and with an expectation that preparation would produce results. She spent 2 years researching expedition companies before paying approximately $400,000 for a luxury Everest package that included private medical support, helicopter evacuation coverage, a dedicated Sherpa, and one of the highest guide-to-client ratios operating on the mountain at the time. On paper, she looked like an ideal Everest client, physically healthy, disciplined, organized, and experienced at altitude. Revelijn followed schedules exactly, maintained her training, and rarely complained. What several members of the guiding staff noticed, however, was that she treated feedback as information to evaluate rather than instruction to accept. Suggestions about extending rest periods, reducing pack weight, or replacing gear were acknowledged, briefly challenged, and then typically set aside if they conflicted with the plan she had already decided on, as if the mountain conditions were adjustable variables in a contract. It's the kind of independence that works great in business. Less so up there. Her assigned Sherpa, Nima Chering, had worked 11 Everest summits and recognized the pattern almost immediately. Revelijn did not ask questions that explored risk. She asked questions that confirmed timelines. During briefings, she kept steering discussions back to oxygen schedules, turnaround targets, and summit timing, often brushing past contingency planning or altitude illness warnings as secondary details. To Nima, it felt like she'd already made up her mind long before she ever got there. Everest didn't really seem like a question for her anymore, more like the last step of something she'd been planning for a long time, something she was already set on finishing no matter what. The expedition team consisted of 7 clients, several of whom had prior high-altitude experience. Internally, Revelijn was viewed as capable, but not among the strongest climbers in the group, particularly compared to younger clients with faster recovery and movement at elevation. During the acclimatization rotations, she completed every required climb successfully, though staff notes recorded intermittent headaches, mild fluid retention, and slower movement on the upper sections near Camp 3 during the later stages of the expedition. None of the observations individually justified removing her from summit clearance, and by May 13th, she was considered medically fit to continue. That afternoon, the team moved from Camp 3 at 24,500 feet to Camp 4 on the South Col at 26,300 feet, where supplemental oxygen became continuous. Revelijn arrived within the expected time window, but more slowly than she had during earlier rotations, particularly on the final stretch approaching the col. No alarms yet, but the change is already there if you're watching closely. Nima noted the change privately, but did not report it as a formal concern. At Camp 4, the group rested for several hours, though Revelijn repeatedly asked for updated forecasts and timing confirmations, as if the schedule itself needed to stay aligned with her paid itinerary rather than the mountain's conditions. Shortly before departure, Nima checked Revelijn's oxygen mask seal for a second time due to a minor fit issue along one side of the facepiece. The seal held. At 11:05 p.m. on May 14th, the team left Camp 4 and began the overnight climb toward the summit of Everest. The week of May 8 through May 13 was Revelijn's final rest period at base camp before the summit push. The expedition had descended from its last acclimatization rotation on May 8th and the guiding team had scheduled 5 days of rest and preparation before the move to the higher camps. The jet stream, which had sat over the upper mountain through much of early May, had lifted 4 days prior. The contracted meteorologist was projecting a usable summit window centered on May 15th, with conditions holding through approximately 10 a.m. before wind and cloud probability increased through the afternoon. The expedition was 2 days behind its original schedule due to the jet stream delay, which meant the window was tighter than preferred, but it was real. Revelane used the rest days with characteristic precision. She ate measured meals, maintained her fluid intake, organized and reorganized her gear, and attended every team briefing with notes already prepared. Everything about her routine still sounds like she's in control of a normal environment. She had stopped mentioning headaches, which she had reported intermittently during the rotation climbs. The base camp physician, a contract doctor staying at base camp for the whole expedition, had written in Revelane's file that she had some mild swelling in her lower legs during the final April rotation. It wasn't unusual at that altitude, but in some people it can be an early sign the body is starting to struggle with the lack of oxygen. The same physician had logged a headache episode at Camp 2 during the second night of the final rotation. Revelane had rated the pain as a 4 on a 10-point scale and noted she was on a standard course of acetazolamide as part of her altitude acclimatization protocol. The symptom resolved within a few hours. The physician noted the episode but did not flag it as a contraindication to summit clearance. The guiding company's lead Western guide reviewed all client medical files before the summit rotation. No changes to Revelane's plan were made. By the time the group prepared to move on May 13th, Revelane was, by observable metrics, among the best prepared clients in the group. She had not complained. She had performed all assigned tasks. She had her gear sorted, her oxygen system tested, and her summit day schedule memorized. The base camp physician cleared her for the summit rotation, along with the rest of the group. The move from Camp 3 at 24,500 feet to Camp 4 at 26,300 feet on May 13 took approximately 5 hours. The route crosses the upper Lhotse face and passes through the Geneva Spur, technical terrain, but well fixed with ropes during peak season. 3 of the 7 clients arrived at Camp 4 ahead of Revelane. She arrived within the expected time window. Nima noted in the cramped logbook he kept for client observations, a personal practice, not a company requirement, that Revelane's pace on the final 600 vertical feet to Camp 4 had been slower than her pace during the Camp 3 rotation, which itself had been her weakest individual segment across the entire acclimatization period. A logbook like that feels more honest than any official report later on. He did not radio this assessment to the lead guide at Camp 4. It was a note he was making for himself about a pattern he was beginning to track. At Camp 4, the group occupied tents on the South Col, a flat, wind-scoured plateau at 26,300 feet that sits between the upper flanks of Everest and Lhotse. The air at that elevation contains approximately 35% of sea-level oxygen concentration. Even supplemental oxygen, delivered at the standard guided client flow rate of 2 liters per minute, leaves the body functioning at an effective altitude equivalent of roughly 23,000 to 24,000 feet without oxygen support. At this height, the brain is basically under constant strain the whole time. Everything in the body is working harder than it normally ever would, and there's really no break for it to recover or reset. The group rested through the late afternoon and evening window at Camp 4, with Revelane eating only a partial meal and drinking roughly a liter of water. She mentioned she was not hungry, a response Nima had seen before at extreme altitude, where appetite often fades under sustained hypoxic stress. Not hungry usually means something else entirely at that height. She began supplemental oxygen at a low-flow pre-sleep setting of 0.5 liters per minute. Whether she slept is unknown. At 26,300 feet, true rest is rare, and most climbers experience fragmented, shallow sleep at best under the pressure of impending summit movement. Later that night, final equipment checks began as the team transitioned from rest into summit preparation. All 7 clients were cleared for departure. Nima inspected Revelane's oxygen mask again and corrected a minor fit issue along the left cheek strap with a secondary tightening. Her flow regulator was increased to 2 liters per minute for the ascent. All systems were within expected operational parameters at the time of check. A short time after the checks were completed, the team left Camp 4 and began the overnight climb toward the summit of Everest. The South Col at night is one of the harshest environments a human being can occupy. The cold at extreme altitude behaves differently than winter cold at lower elevations, cutting through insulation with persistent force. On the night of the climb, temperatures at the col were approximately negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit, with winds between 18 and 22 miles per hour along the ridge. The group moved in single file, clipped into fixed ropes where available, and guided by headlamps through the open sections. Reveline was fifth in line out of 7 clients. Nima followed directly behind her. Above Camp 4, the route climbs roughly 2,700 vertical feet to the summit, passing the balcony at 27,600 feet, then continuing along the southeast ridge to the south summit at 28,700 feet, across the Corniche Traverse, and up the final ridge to 29,032 feet. The team reached the balcony just before dawn. On the way up, Nima noticed she was starting to fall a bit behind the climber in front of her. He moved closer and put a hand on her pack just to steady her and keep her with the group. At the balcony, while they were swapping oxygen, she struggled for a moment with a backup clip on her harness, something she'd done without thinking on earlier climbs. Small mistakes start showing up in places that used to feel automatic. Nima stepped in and secured it. She did not acknowledge him or look in his direction. Above the balcony, the wind had increased to an estimated 25 to 30 miles per hour. The temperature with wind chill had dropped to approximately 31 degrees Fahrenheit. The sky remained clear. By this point, the lead Western guide was approximately 200 vertical feet ahead with the 2 fastest clients, and Reveline had dropped to trailing the climber ahead of her by 40 feet. Nima shortened his tether and moved to within arm's reach of her. On the southeast ridge, Nima watched her foot placement with close attention. Over the following stretch, he noted 2 instances where her crampon placements were slightly off on fixed rope clips. Not errors that posed immediate danger, but deviations from the steady, controlled movement she had shown at lower elevations. They were small inconsistencies, the kind that only stood out when someone was watching for patterns rather than single moments. Farther along the route, below the south summit, Reveline paused without instruction or warning. She had not reached a designated rest point. She stopped on the fixed line, not as a collapse, but as a decision point, standing there as if evaluating whether the pace around her was still acceptable, before remaining still for several dozen seconds. The climber ahead continued without noticing. Nima moved alongside her, and she straightened and resumed movement without comment. No radio update was made at that time, and the lead guide had already moved higher on the ridge. Later, Reveline reached the south summit after several hours of continuous ascent from Camp 4. By that point, she had been climbing for most of the night, and the group had already begun to stretch out along the upper route. Several climbers were ahead of her toward the final sections, while one client behind her had already initiated a controlled descent with support after experiencing cold-related issues. Reveline was now near the back of the remaining group. As they transitioned toward the final stages of the climb, she sat down in the snow at the south summit without being directed to do so. Sitting there mid-route feels strangely final, even if nobody says it. It is a legitimate rest point, the only defined one between there and the true summit. But the decision to sit rather than simply stop standing was a small, legible marker to anyone watching the right things. Nima checked her oxygen gauge. She had about 90 minutes of oxygen left at that flow rate, enough to reach the summit and start heading down. Nima looked at her through the mask. Her eyes were open and tracking, but something about her felt slower. He gave the hand signal for a status check, rotating his palm in front of her, and after a pause, she gave him a thumbs up. It came back a little delayed, not as quick or automatic as before. He radioed the lead guide. He reported that his client was slow and requested a time check. The lead guide confirmed the 3 clients ahead were on approach to the summit and that the weather window was holding. He asked for Nima's recommendation. Nima said he needed 5 more minutes to assess. The lead guide acknowledged. A short time later, Reveline stood, adjusted her pack, and resumed movement toward the Corniche Traverse. She did so without signaling or waiting for confirmation, continuing along the fixed line as the route narrowed into the exposed traverse leading toward the final ridge. She moved because the summit was ahead and, in her internal logic, carried from her Scottsdale office. Outcomes were things you completed once all required inputs had been paid for and executed correctly, not something negotiated with the mountain at 28,700 feet. The $400,000 fee, the 6 weeks of rotations, the filed medical clearance, the perfectly organized gear, the satellite phone journal, the gap on the east wall of her office. All of it was still ahead of her, 332 vertical feet up and 45 minutes of movement away, and she was not going to stop because a Sherpa she had hired to support her ascent had not yet given a signal she had not asked for. She reached the fixed rope on the cornice traverse and started clipping in properly. Her movements were slow and mechanical, but still doing what they needed to do. Nima stayed right behind her. Nothing was really said or decided out loud. They just kept going, and that in itself became the decision. The cornice traverse runs along the upper edge of a massive snow formation that overhangs the Kangshung face on the east side, a near vertical drop of more than 2 miles toward Tibet, while the opposite side carries the fixed rope descent lines toward Camp 4. The path is narrow, sometimes no wider than a few feet across wind-compacted snow. Reveline crossed it. She descended to the Hillary Step, climbed the step on the fixed ropes, and in the early morning hours on May 15th, 2016 stepped onto the summit of Mount Everest at 29,032 feet. Hard to imagine what that first step onto the top actually feels like. She was the last client to summit. She had been climbing for over 8 hours. She arrived approximately 14 minutes after the 5th client. She stood at the summit for an estimated 4 minutes while Nima took photographs. In those photographs, her posture is upright. Her eyes are visible above the oxygen mask. The sky behind her is pale blue with no cloud present. She is standing at 29,032 feet, the highest point on the surface of the earth, and she is standing there because she worked for it and planned for it and paid for it and did not stop moving when a more cautious person might have. And for those 4 minutes, on the specific evidence of those images, the thing she had been trying to prove appeared true. Shortly after reaching the summit, the team turned around and began their descent. The Hillary step in descent is different from the ascent. The body is depleted, the fixed lines are used in reverse, and downward movement requires a different kind of attention than climbing up. Reveline descended the step slowly. Her clip and lower technique on the fixed lines was correct, but she paused at several anchor points longer than standard, including one stop of approximately 75 seconds. Nima remained directly above her on the line throughout. On the cornice traverse, back toward the south summit, Reveline's right foot slipped on a section of wind-crusted snow. Even a small slip up there probably feels louder than it should. The slip was small. She did not fall, did not lose her clip, and was never in immediate danger, but her recovery was slow. She stood still for nearly a full minute before resuming movement. Nima placed his hand on the back of her pack and kept it there. On the descent below the south summit, at about 28,550 feet on the fixed line, Reveline just stopped. No stumble, no fall. She was still clipped in, still standing, but she didn't take another step. Nima moved alongside her on the slope and checked her oxygen flow indicator immediately. The needle read approximately 1.8 liters per minute, within normal operational range, not a system failure. He checked her face through the mask. Her eyes were open and blinking, but her gaze was oriented slightly downward and to the left, toward the Kangshung face. The Kangshung face is on the east side of Everest, not where they were headed, not back toward Camp 4, not really connected to anything they needed to be focused on at that moment. She was just looking at it, the way someone stares off at something without really explaining it, or like her attention had drifted somewhere else entirely. Nima made 3 hand signals, indicating downward movement. She did not respond to any of them. He radioed the lead guide and reported that his client was unresponsive to direction at approximately 28,500 feet. The lead guide was already below the balcony with 2 clients and radioed back that he was dispatching the nearest available support Sherpa upward from below. That Sherpa was at approximately 27,800 feet, roughly 700 vertical feet lower. Over the next 6 minutes, Nima attempted to physically guide Reveline into a downward position on the fixed line. He repositioned her feet. He applied directional pressure to her pack. She took 2 steps and then sat down in the snow, facing the Kangshung face. The sit was controlled. She did not collapse, did not lose her clip, did not fall in any direction. She sat down in the snow at 28,550 feet as though she had arrived somewhere and had decided to remain. Moving a 162-pound client in full expedition gear, insulated suit, oxygen system, crampons, pack, downward on technical fixed-line terrain above 28,000 feet without a second person risks both the client and the guide. Nima maintained her position, kept her clipped to the line, continued radio contact, and waited. He checked her oxygen again, still flowing. He checked her pulse at the neck through his insulated gloves. He could feel a presence, but the insulation prevented any confident assessment of rate or quality. The second Sherpa arrived roughly a short time later, about 20 minutes after Reveline had stopped moving. The two Sherpas started a controlled, two-person assisted descent on the fixed ropes. Reveline could still take some weight when she was positioned right, but she wasn't really moving on her own anymore. Getting down those roughly 900 vertical feet back to the balcony at 27,600 feet took just under 3 hours. By the time they arrived, she couldn't really hold herself up without full help. A third Sherpa arrived from Camp 4 as conditions began to deteriorate. Wind speeds increased into the upper range of the forecast, and cloud cover started building in from the west, matching the afternoon shift predicted by the expedition meteorologist. The weather window that had supported the summit push was beginning to close over the descent. Later on, the lower section above Camp 4, Reveline became fully unresponsive. Her oxygen tank was replaced with a full reserve bottle. At that altitude and on steep fixed lines, CPR was not possible. The three Sherpas continued the assisted lowering. She was brought to the edge of Camp 4 after an extended descent effort, arriving in the late afternoon window as conditions continued to worsen. The base camp physician had been updated by radio throughout the assisted descent and had pre-positioned a gammo bag, a portable hyperbaric chamber that, when manually pressurized, simulates a rapid descent to lower altitude at Camp 4 via a supply Sherpa. Reveline was placed inside the bag shortly after arriving. Pressurization began, simulating conditions equivalent to roughly 15,000 feet. The physician monitored her status by radio relay from base camp, with Nima reporting from Camp 4. Over the next half hour, there was no response. Silence at that altitude hits differently than silence anywhere else. Later that afternoon, Reveline was declared unresponsive with no pulse. Weather conditions prevented helicopter access to Camp 4 for the rest of the day. Her body remained at Camp 4 overnight. Weather conditions prevented any immediate evacuation from the upper mountain. Reveline's body remained at Camp 4 overnight before recovery efforts resumed the following morning. Over the next stage of the operation, Sherpas first lowered her body to a lower camp, where helicopter extraction became possible during a brief weather window. Her body was transported down to Kathmandu and later repatriated to the United States, arriving in Scottsdale, Arizona, several days later. The receiving medical examiner's office coordinated with the post-incident report submitted by the guiding company to Nepal's tourism authorities. The official cause of death was high-altitude cerebral edema, a condition in which physiological stress at extreme elevation causes fluid to accumulate within brain tissue, producing swelling inside a skull that cannot expand. At a threshold that varies by individual and cannot be predicted with precision, that pressure impairs the brain's ability to regulate basic function, and that function ceases. It's hard to catch early because the signs, moving slower, reacting less, getting a bit confused or disoriented, look a lot like normal exhaustion up there. After hours at that altitude, most climbers are already worn down anyway, and there's no real way to check what's happening inside the brain in real time. A secondary finding noted pulmonary fluid consistent with early-stage high-altitude pulmonary edema, suggesting the physiological cascade had likely been developing during the final day of the climb at Camp 4, or possibly during the late stages of the ascent, well before the summit was reached. The guiding company's internal review, submitted to the expedition physician and relevant tourism authorities, concluded that no single decision in the sequence constituted a clear protocol violation. The fluid retention noted during late April rotations, the reduced intake at Camp 4, the slowing pace on the southeast ridge, and the delayed responsiveness near the south summit were each within acceptable ranges for high-altitude expedition management when considered independently. The review described the pattern as a compounding subclinical presentation, a progression in which each indicator, taken alone, was not sufficient to trigger intervention. In sequence, from the earliest acclimatization rotations through the final descent above Camp 4, they formed a trajectory that, in retrospect, could be recognized as deterioration at extreme altitude rather than isolated fatigue.